It's almost as if it is impossible not to open a newspaper or go to a newsfeed without there being something coming from Meghan at the moment. We all feel as if she's actually moved on and is developing a new, much more authentic her.
I mean, this kind of old and new Meghan narrative is one that I don't buy into. She's been her authentic self the whole time. But I do think, she was asked about about being in authentic times where she's felt that she couldn't be 100% herself. That's what I mean to say, rather than use the word inauthentic.
If she was still part of that firm, those speeches would be front page news, wouldn't they? It wouldn't be pantyhose. It would be her, talking about really, really very big issues.
And you're absolutely right, and that it's a real missed opportunity actually that she is not still a working royal, because she had and still has a powerful voice and delivered some excellent speeches, like you said, and had a different reach of people, different people that she could reach all around the world. And the royal family are poorer for not having Meghan and Harry as working royals doing this really important work.
But how can you? I would imagine they think that every day, that actually there is such a resource there, but it was a resource that somehow just didn't go in the right direction. And Matt, is that something that is that a ball they dropped, do you think?
100%.
Sorry. When were you called Matt?
It's a tricky one. I mean, look, wouldn't it be wonderful if Harry and Meghan were there with William and Catherine, and we had this fantastic foursome supporting the king?
Meghan is who she says she is, right? She's always been her authentic self. She's had to adapt to different situations. I think what we're seeing now is a woman who is being able to grow and to flourish in this role that she is in, and doing things that she loves, happy at home with her family. And I think if you go where you're appreciated, number one, and if you're watered correctly, then you're going to flourish. And that's absolutely what we're seeing.
Matt, were we watering her incorrectly in this country?
Oh, maybe it's the weather over here. Maybe that's why.
Oh, yeah.
No, I just don't think it was a good fit. We all wanted it to work. I think, as I say, Harry rightly had issues with the treatment of Meghan, and I do think things would change in the future. What happens when George gets a woman comes along for George? But
what happens when a black woman comes along for George?
I think I don't put it all down to race. I don't put it all
down to race, but it's a huge factor of it. I think it's race, it's class. She was American, divorced, a few years older than him, an actress, and she was biracial.
That conversation is one of those rare moments where the mask slips for just a second on British television. And honestly, you almost have to replay it because you're sitting there wondering, wait, are they actually admitting this out loud? Because after years of headlines, years of smears, years of pretending Harry and Meghan were the great catastrophe of modern monarchy, suddenly we have television hosts and royal commentators calmly saying something millions of people have been saying since the beginning. The royal family lost something valuable when Harry and Meghan left. Not only that, but they openly admitted Meghan had a powerful voice, global reach, authenticity, and the ability to connect with people in a way the institution simply could not replicate. That is a massive shift. And what makes this conversation even more fascinating is that nobody on that panel sounded angry while saying it. Nobody sounded defensive. Nobody sounded like they were trying to start a war. It sounded more like people slowly realizing that history may not remember the situation the way the tabloids wanted it remembered. Because think about the language they used. A missed opportunity. The royal family are poorer without Meghan and Harry. Harry rightly had issues with Meghan's treatment. Those are not small statements. Those are admissions. And what really struck me listening to this discussion is how different the tone feels now compared to a few years ago. There was a time when any defense of Meghan on British television immediately turned into chaos. You could practically hear producers hyperventilating in the background. Somebody would start shouting. Somebody would accuse Harry and Meghan of destroying the monarchy before the commercial break even arrived. But this conversation felt different. It felt calmer, more reflective, almost like reality has finally started catching up with the narrative. Because let's be honest, one of the biggest problems for the anti-Meghan machine is that Meghan herself did not collapse after leaving. That was the expectation. That was the fantasy. The narrative depended on Harry and Meghan failing spectacularly outside the institution. The entire logic of the criticism rested on the idea that royal life was the peak of existence and that leaving it would automatically destroy them. Instead, people watched Meghan build a new chapter on her own terms, and that has deeply confused some people. You can hear it in Lawrence's comments at the beginning of the clip. He says it feels impossible to open a newspaper or newsfeed without seeing Meghan. That line is actually more important than it sounds, because beneath all the criticism, beneath all the outrage, beneath all the endless commentary, there's an uncomfortable truth the media can no longer hide from. Meghan remains culturally relevant. And not just relevant, interesting. That's the part they struggle with. Because for years there has been this effort to portray her as someone the public was supposedly tired of. Yet every conversation about her becomes a headline, every appearance becomes a debate, every interview becomes a discussion, every project trends. At some point, people have to admit reality. You cannot spend years insisting someone is irrelevant while simultaneously building entire media cycles around them. That contradiction eventually starts looking ridiculous. And Afua Hagan was absolutely right to push back against the idea of an old Meghan versus a new Meghan. That framing has always been strange because it suggests Meghan only became authentic after leaving the royal family. But Afua correctly points out that Meghan was always herself. The issue was whether she was allowed to fully exist as herself within that environment. That is an entirely different conversation. And honestly, it's one of the most important points anyone can make about this entire saga, because institutions love individuality right up until individuality becomes too visible. People love the idea of modernization until modernization actually arrives. They love the idea of diversity until diversity speaks. They love confidence until confidence refuses to shrink itself. And Meghan walked into one of the most tradition-bound institutions on Earth, already fully formed. She already had a career, she already had opinions, she already understood public speaking, she already understood humanitarian work, she already understood global audiences. That changes the dynamic completely. She was not entering the system as someone waiting to be shaped from scratch, and I think that unsettled certain people more than they want to admit. What Afua said about adaptation was also incredibly important. She explained that Meghan wasn't being fake, she was adapting to circumstances where she may not have felt able to fully express herself. Most people understand this instinctively. Human beings adapt constantly depending on environment. You behave differently at work than you do with friends, differently with family than with strangers, differently in spaces where you feel welcomed versus spaces where you feel scrutinized. That's normal. But what's fascinating is how often Meghan was denied the basic human complexity everybody else receives automatically. Other royals are allowed growth. Other royals are allowed mistakes. Other royals are allowed awkward phases. Other royals are allowed reinvention. But Meghan was frequently expected to remain frozen inside a single narrative crafted by other people, and when she refused to stay inside it, that became the problem. That's why this clip matters so much, because the panel is finally discussing Meghan as a human being, rather than a symbol people project onto. And the section where they discuss speeches is incredibly revealing. Lawrence points out that if Meghan were still inside the institution, many of her speeches would dominate front pages because the topics themselves are significant. That is true, and it raises a fascinating question. How much potential was wasted because the institution failed to evolve fast enough to accommodate people who represented the future rather than the past? Because regardless of how anyone personally feels about Meghan, you cannot deny she brought something globally recognizable to the monarchy: modernity, cultural fluency, international appeal, a different communication style, a different generational energy. And what's remarkable is that even critics are beginning to acknowledge that now. The phrase, "the royal family are poorer without Meghan and Harry," really stayed with me because it cuts through years of noise instantly. Poorer in image, poorer in reach, poorer in connection, poorer in generational relevance, poorer in emotional resonance, and perhaps most importantly, poorer in possibility, because Harry and Meghan represented an opportunity for the monarchy to genuinely evolve in public, not cosmetically, not through carefully staged PR campaigns, actually evolve. And instead, the entire thing imploded into defensiveness, panic, leaks, media warfare, and institutional rigidity. That's the tragedy underneath all this chaos, not just for Harry and Meghan, for the institution itself. Because imagine what could have been possible if the energy spent attacking Meghan had instead been spent supporting her. Imagine a monarchy that genuinely embraced fresh perspectives instead of treating them as threats. Imagine the global goodwill that could have existed. Imagine the younger audiences they might have connected with. Imagine the cultural bridges that could have been built. Instead, what people often saw was conflict, and institutions rarely look strong when they appear afraid of change. That's another reason Matt Wilkinson's comments stood out. When he says Harry rightly had issues with the treatment of Meghan, he is validating something Harry has been saying for years. But acknowledging Harry's concerns were legitimate changes the framing significantly. Because for years, critics tried to reduce Harry's perspective to emotional overreaction. But now, even royal commentators are admitting there were real problems. And honestly, history tends to be kinder to people who challenge broken systems than contemporary media is. At the time, challengers are called disruptive, difficult, ungrateful, disloyal. Later, people quietly admit they had a point. Human civilization runs on this cycle constantly. Somebody warns about a problem, society mocks them, 5 years later, everybody pretends they agreed all along. An exhaustive species, honestly. But the emotional center of this clip comes from Afua's statement about flourishing where you are appreciated. That line hit people because it applies far beyond royalty. Most people understand what it feels like to be diminished in one environment and empowered in another. Most people understand the difference between surviving and flourishing. And when Afua says Meghan appears happy at home with her family and able to grow in this new role, that observation matters because it's visible. You can disagree with Meghan politically, stylistically, culturally, whatever, but happiness is difficult to fake consistently over years. Peace changes people. Freedom changes people. Being in spaces where you are not constantly monitored, criticized, or constrained changes people. And I think part of the frustration among some royal commentators is that Meghan and Harry were expected to spend years publicly miserable after leaving. Instead, they built a life. Not a perfect life, not a controversy-free life, but a life with autonomy. And autonomy is powerful, especially when people expected dependency. One of the most revealing moments comes when Lawrence asks Matt whether Britain watered her incorrectly. That metaphor says everything, because it frames the conversation differently. Not what was wrong with Meghan, but what conditions existed around her. That is a mature conversation. And Matt's joking response about the weather is interesting, because humor often appears when people feel uncomfortable approaching deeper truths directly. Because beneath the joke lies a real issue. Was Britain prepared for somebody like Meghan? Not theoretically, not symbolically, actually prepared? Afua then sharpens the discussion even further by pointing out the multiple layers involved: race, class, nationality, age, career background, divorce status. That nuance is important because oversimplification helps nobody. Meghan represented several departures from traditional royal expectations simultaneously, and institutions built on tradition often struggle when too many norms are challenged at once. What I appreciated about Afua's contribution is that she refused to reduce Meghan into either saint or villain. She talked about systems, pressures, adaptation, identity, and environment. That's a more intelligent conversation than the shallow tabloid framing people have endured for years. And honestly, there's another reason this clip feels important. It reflects fatigue. Not fatigue with Meghan, fatigue with the war around Meghan. People are exhausted by constant outrage cycles, exhausted by endless hostility, exhausted by the refusal to acknowledge obvious realities. Because whether people love Meghan, dislike Meghan, or feel neutral about her, one thing has become increasingly difficult to deny. She made an impact, a real one, and the monarchy still hasn't fully figured out how to replace the energy Harry and Meghan brought. That absence lingers. You can feel it in conversations like this. You can hear it when commentators imagine what things could have looked like if the relationships had survived. And perhaps that's why discussions about Harry and Meghan continue years later, not because they failed, but because the story still feels unresolved emotionally for many people. There remains this lingering sense of lost potential. And ironically, the more the media insisted Harry and Meghan were unimportant, the more obvious their significance became. Because institutions do not spend this much time obsessing over people who do not matter. Neither does the media. The constant fixation itself became evidence. And that's why Lawrence's opening observation is so revealing. Meghan remains a central figure in modern cultural conversation because she intersects with so many broader issues: tradition versus modernity, institution versus individuality, public duty versus personal well-being, race, gender, media power, celebrity culture, identity, family, freedom. People project all kinds of hopes and anxieties onto her story. That's why the conversation never fully disappears. And whether critics like it or not, Meghan has managed something very difficult in public life. She survived being turned into a global controversy and still retained her sense of self. That is not easy. Many public figures disappear under that level of pressure. Some become bitter. Some become silent. Some spend years trying desperately to win approval from people who will never give it. Meghan chose something different: distance, reinvention, selective visibility, and control over her own narrative. That decision continues to irritate people who preferred access to a version of her shaped entirely through tabloids. But it also explains why discussions around her are evolving, because time changes perspective. When emotions cool, people reassess, and increasingly, more voices seem willing to admit the situation was mishandled from the start. Not by one individual alone, by a broader ecosystem that failed to understand the moment it was living through. And honestly, there's something almost tragic about realizing too late what you had. That feeling hangs over this clip. Not rage, not hatred, regret. The sense that a different outcome was possible, a better outcome, one built on support instead of suspicion, partnership instead of panic, adaptation instead of rigidity. And maybe that's why this conversation feels so compelling, because beneath the media chatter and royal analysis, it touches on something deeply human. What happens when someone outgrows an environment that never truly knew what to do with them? Some people call it betrayal. Others call it survival. But either way, growth usually unsettles those who benefited from your smaller version. And Meghan no longer fits inside the version of her story many people originally tried to create. That's the real shift happening now. The narrative control is weakening. Reality keeps interrupting it. People can see Meghan speaking confidently, working confidently, living confidently, building confidently, and eventually, even critics have to acknowledge what's directly in front of them. That doesn't mean everyone suddenly becomes a fan, but it does mean the conversation becomes harder to manipulate. And that's why this UK television discussion matters so much. Because once mainstream voices begin openly admitting the monarchy lost something important, the public conversation changes permanently. The question is no longer, did Meghan matter? Now the question is, what might have happened if she had truly been supported? And honestly, that may be the one question the institution never wanted people asking. Too late now. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Smiley here, and take care.